Hey everyone, welcome, hope you're doing well. Today, we're diving into the book of Haggai. It's a short book, but packed with powerful messages. Now, Haggai's got some really important context about the Israelites rebuilding the temple, but it also speaks directly to us about spiritual growth and how we can sometimes get sidetracked. So, stick around as we explore what hinders our growth and how we can get back on track with God. Alright, let's get into it. Alright, so let's set the scene a bit before we dive into the message of Haggai. And this is important because understanding the history gives us a clearer picture of what was going on spiritually for the Israelites. Now, you might know this, but Israel had been through a lot by the time we get to Haggai. The kingdom was split into two parts, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And to make a long story short, the southern kingdom of Judah had been through a series of invasions and struggles, mostly brought on by their own disobedience to God. They had ignored God's commands, and because of that, they faced the consequences of their actions. One of the most significant events in this history was the Babylonian exile. It was a really tough time for the people of Judah. The Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, came in and completely wiped out Jerusalem. This wasn't just some minor raid, it was an absolute devastation. They destroyed the city, and more importantly, they destroyed the temple, the center of worship, the place where the Israelites experienced God's presence. It was a devastating blow, both physically and spiritually. Imagine for a moment your whole community, everything you've known, just taken away. And not just your homes or your city, but your very place of worship where you connected with God is gone. Now, this didn't just happen once. There were three major waves of Babylonian invasions. The first wave was in 609 BC, and it was followed by two more until, in 586 BC, the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem completely. They took most of the people from Judah back to Babylon as captives. The Bible tells us that they carried off the best and the brightest, the people who had something to offer. So, people like Daniel and his three friends, who we know well, were among the exiles taken to Babylon. Imagine the trauma of being forced to leave your homeland and live in a foreign land with strange languages, customs, and gods. For many of the people, this was not just exile from a place. It felt like being cut off from everything they knew about God and their identity. Now, after about 70 years of exile, God, in His mercy, begins to move in the hearts of foreign rulers. The Persians, under King Cyrus, conquer the Babylonians and take over their empire. In an unexpected turn of events, Cyrus, who wasn't even a follower of God, issues a decree allowing the Israelites to return to their land and rebuild their temple. Can you imagine the excitement? After all those years in captivity, God's people were finally going home. It was like a spiritual and physical freedom they had been longing for. They were finally going to return to their land, rebuild the city, and most importantly, rebuild the temple, their connection to God. The people were ecstatic about this opportunity. They had been spiritually restless in exile, longing for the restoration of their relationship with God. So, when they returned to Jerusalem, they got straight to work. They started laying the foundation of the temple. And there was this huge celebration that just, in the book of Ezra, when it describes the moment when they laid the foundation, the priests blew trumpets, and the Levites played cymbals, praising God. It was like a giant party, a moment of worship, a real celebration of God's faithfulness. People were shouting for joy, praising God because the foundation of the temple had been laid. You could feel the energy, the excitement in the air. People were so hopeful, so full of zeal. They were finally rebuilding what had been lost. And it felt like a new beginning. But here's the thing, this is where things start to get complicated. After this initial excitement, things started to slow down. The zeal that had been so strong began to fade. The people had started strong, but after a while, they got discouraged. External opposition came their way. You see, it was the neighboring people around Jerusalem weren't exactly thrilled to see the Jews returning and rebuilding. They didn't want the Israelites to restore their city and their temple, because that would mean the Jews were gaining power and influence again. So, these neighboring people began to oppose the rebuilding efforts, They used all sorts of tactics: discouragement, fear, and even threats. They tried to intimidate the Jews and disrupt the progress of the temple. Some of them even went so far as to hire counselors to frustrate the building efforts. This opposition worked. The Israelites started to lose heart. The challenges they faced were real, and they became weary. The once passionate builders were now finding it harder to stay motivated. The excitement faded, and the work on the temple came to a halt. They didn't stop completely, but the progress stalled. This is where things got tricky. Over time, the people started to focus more on their own lives. They began to prioritize rebuilding their homes, fixing up their houses, making sure their own lives were in order. But the temple, the place of spiritual connection with God, was neglected. The more the people turned inward, focusing on their material needs, the less they focused on the work that God had called them to do. Now, remember, there's nothing wrong with taking care of your own home. It's not bad to want to improve your life, to build your house, to take care of your personal needs. But here's where the problem lies. The people of Judah had allowed their own desires to take priority over their spiritual commitment. They were putting their personal interests ahead of their relationship with God. And as they neglected God's house, the spiritual connection began to fade. They started putting off what they knew they needed to do, pushing aside the work of rebuilding the temple because other things had taken priority. This is where Haggai comes into the picture. The prophet Haggai is sent by God to confront the people and call them back to their priorities. He's there to remind them of what they had started and what they had left unfinished. He says, "Look, you've been focusing so much on your own homes, but the house of God is lying in ruins." Haggai is sent to remind them that they need to refocus their energies, stop making excuses, and get back to the work of building the temple. God's house had been neglected, and it was time to make it a priority again. Haggai's message wasn't just about a building project, it was about spiritual renewal. God wanted the people to realize that when they put Him first, everything else would fall into place. The reason they were experiencing drought, the reason their crops weren't growing, the reason their work felt unfruitful was because they had neglected their relationship with God. God was calling them back, urging them to put His house first, to give their full attention to the work of spiritual restoration. This is where the story of Haggai speaks to us today. Sometimes we can get so caught up in our own lives, our work, our relationships, our personal goals that we neglect our spiritual health. We can become so focused on what we want to build, what we want to achieve, that we forget to tend to our relationship with God. And when that happens, we can feel like something is missing, like we're working hard but not seeing the fruit. We get discouraged, and just like the Israelites, we can lose our zeal for spiritual growth. But the good news is that God is always calling us back, just like He did with the Israelites through Haggai. He's calling us to refocus our priorities, to put Him back in the center of our lives. It's a reminder that our spiritual health should come first. When we seek God first, everything else falls into place. So, the question is, are we putting God's work first in our lives, or are we letting other things take His place? It's time to take a step back, just like the Israelites did, and see where we've lost our focus. Are we ready to get back to work? Are we ready to rebuild what's been neglected in our spiritual lives? Let's take a moment to reflect on that. So, as we jump back into the story of the Israelites and their struggle to rebuild the temple, I want to focus on something really important that played a big part in their setback: external opposition. We see in the book of Ezra and Haggai how the Israelites were initially full of zeal and excitement, eager to restore their connection with God by rebuilding the temple. But then, something happened that slowed down their progress: external opposition. And this opposition didn't just come in the form of direct attacks or military invasions. No, it was much more subtle and insidious. The people around them started to discourage them, to intimidate them, and to make them afraid. And it worked. Their enthusiasm faded, and the project stalled. This external opposition came from the surrounding nations, the people who were living near Jerusalem, and they didn't want to see the Israelites succeed. They didn't want the Jews to rebuild the temple and become a powerful force once again. So they did everything they could to stop it. They started by using discouragement. They mocked the Israelites, telling them that they would never be able to rebuild the temple, that it was a lost cause. These neighboring nations wanted to make the Israelites believe that their efforts were futile. They used words and tactics designed to break their spirits, to make them doubt their mission. This kind of opposition discouragement can be incredibly powerful. It's not physical. It doesn't involve an army marching in. It's the kind of opposition that gets into your mind, planting seeds of doubt, telling you that you're not good enough, that your efforts won't make a difference, that you might as well give up. It's a whisper, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, but it wears you down over time. It's a powerful tactic, one that the enemy uses today in our spiritual lives as well. How often do we hear those voices either from others or from our own minds that tell us our spiritual efforts are pointless? How many times have we been discouraged from pursuing God wholeheartedly because the world around us doesn't understand, doesn't care, or even mocks us for our faith, but it didn't stop with discouragement. The opposition ramped up with intimidation. These people around the Israelites didn't just speak against them, they tried to scare them into giving up. In the case of the Israelites, they threatened them with physical violence. They used their power and influence to intimidate the Jews, trying to make them afraid of continuing the work. They didn't want the Israelites to get too comfortable, to feel like they had the support they needed to finish the temple. So, they used fear tactics. They wanted to make the Israelites feel like continuing the project was dangerous, like they were putting their lives at risk. And you know, fear is a powerful thing. It can stop us in our tracks, paralyze us, make us second guess every decision we've made. When we're intimidated, it's easy to let go of our zeal and passion. How many of us have been in situations where we've been afraid to stand up for our faith, to speak about what we believe, because we're worried about how others will react? Maybe it's in the workplace, at school, or even in our own families. Fear of being rejected, ridiculed, or persecuted can keep us from moving forward in our spiritual lives. Just like the Israelites, we may feel like the opposition is too great, too powerful for us to overcome. The fear of what might happen can be overwhelming, and it causes us to shrink back, to hesitate, to stop making progress in our relationship with God. Now, here's the thing, this kind of opposition, the discouragement, the intimidation, the fear didn't just affect the Israelites temporarily. It had a long-term impact on them. In fact, the work on the temple stopped altogether for a period of about 15 years. That's right, 15 years. The people had laid the foundation. They had started strong, but after facing these external pressures, they stopped. They put the work on hold, and for over a decade, nothing happened. Their zeal for the project had evaporated, and they had become comfortable with the idea of leaving things unfinished. And that, I think, is one of the most dangerous things that opposition can do. It can cause us to lose our momentum, our drive, our passion. It can make us settle into a comfortable apathy where we stop striving for spiritual growth, where we stop pursuing God, and where we just let life happen around us without making any real effort to move forward. But here's the thing, this isn't just something that happened in the past. This is something that happens to us today in our spiritual journeys. We face external opposition in many different forms, and it can have the same kind of impact on us that it had on the Israelites. For some of us, the opposition comes from people around us. Maybe it's family members, friends, or co-workers who don't understand our faith. Maybe they mock us, call us naive, or try to make us feel guilty for following Jesus. Maybe they actively discourage us from pursuing a relationship with God, telling us that we're wasting our time or that we should be focusing on other things. This kind of discouragement can take a toll on us. It can wear us down, make us question if we're doing the right thing, and even make us wonder if our efforts are really worth it. Other times, the opposition takes the form of intimidation, just like it did for the Israelites. We might be afraid to share our faith with others because we're worried about how they'll react. We might be afraid of being labeled as too religious or too extreme, and the fear of rejection or persecution can be enough to silence us. This intimidation doesn't have to come from people who are overtly hostile to our faith. It can come from social pressures, from the desire to fit in with those around us. When we see that the world doesn't value the same things we do, it can be tempting to shrink back and just go with the flow, to stop standing up for what we believe in because we don't want to rock the boat. And just like the Israelites, we might find ourselves hesitating, waiting for the right time, or thinking that the risks are too great to move forward in our faith. The reality is that external opposition, in whatever form it takes, can cause us to lose our zeal for the things of the Lord. It can distract us from our purpose, slow us down, and even stop us from doing the work that God has called us to do. But here's the important thing: while external opposition is real, it doesn't have to define our journey. The Israelites eventually overcame their opposition, but it didn't happen immediately. They needed a wake-up call, and that's where the prophet Haggai comes in. Haggai's role was to remind the people of God's calling, to encourage them to push through the opposition, and to reignite their passion for the work they had started. He called them to refocus on the temple, to remember that God had a purpose for them, and that their work mattered. In the same way, when we face external opposition, whether it's discouragement, intimidation, or fear, we need to remind ourselves of God's calling on our lives. We need to hear the voice of Haggai, or more accurately, the voice of God, calling us to continue the work He has given us, to not be swayed by the opinions or pressures of the world around us. We need to refocus on our purpose and remember that our relationship with God is worth fighting for. No matter what opposition we face, the external pressures are real, but they don't have to define our journey. The Israelites were able to finish rebuilding the temple because they chose to listen to God's call, to push through the opposition, and to get back to work. And just like them, we can press forward in our spiritual lives. When we're discouraged, we can find strength in God's promises. When we're intimidated, we can find courage in His power. And when fear threatens to overwhelm us, we can remember that God is with us every step of the way. Just like the Israelites, we may face opposition, but we can also experience the power of God working in and through us to accomplish His purposes. So, let's not let the external opposition we face in our spiritual journey stop us. Let's keep pressing forward, knowing that God is with us, that He has called us to something greater, and that He will help us overcome whatever obstacles come our way. Don't let the discouragement, intimidation, or fear win. Keep going, keep building, and keep following God with all your heart. As we continue to explore the story of the Israelites and their journey to rebuild the temple, I want to dive into something that is at the heart of why their progress stalled internal confliction. Now, we've already seen how external opposition people, discouraging them and intimidating them, slowed down their progress. But the truth is, the external pressures were only part of the story. The bigger issue, the one that really caused the rebuilding effort to come to a grinding halt, was internal confliction. You see, as the Israelites began their journey of rebuilding the temple, they started with incredible excitement and zeal. They laid the foundation, celebrated with great joy, and everything seemed to be on the right track. But over time, they started to prioritize their own needs over God's needs. They became distracted by their personal desires and ambitions. The temple was no longer their focus. Their own homes and personal comfort took center stage. And when this shift happened, the rebuilding project came to a standstill. Now, I want to take a moment to really understand what happened here. In Haggai 1:3-4, we read that God sent the prophet to speak to the people, saying, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, while this house remains in ruins?" What's interesting about this is that God wasn't just talking about the physical structures. Sure, He was concerned about the literal temple, the building they were supposed to rebuild, but He was also addressing something deeper: their hearts, their priorities. The Israelites had turned their attention to rebuilding their own homes, their own comforts, while neglecting God's house, His place of worship. They were more focused on their personal, material needs than on their spiritual needs. God's question here is profound because it reveals a fundamental truth about human nature. We are often quick to take care of our own desires and needs, sometimes at the expense of what God desires for us. In this case, the people had been given the opportunity to rebuild the temple, the place where they would reconnect with God, worship Him, and experience His presence, but they allowed their personal interests making their homes more comfortable, focusing on their own success and security to take priority over the things of God. And this is something that happens to all of us at some point or another. We live in a world that constantly encourages us to focus on ourselves. It's all about getting ahead, securing our future, taking care of our families, improving our lives. None of these things are inherently bad. Of course, we all have needs, and it's important to care for ourselves and our loved ones. But here's the catch: when we begin to put our personal interests, our comfort, and our success above our relationship with God, we end up neglecting our spiritual health. The Israelites were so busy focusing on their own homes that they completely neglected the temple, the place where they could meet with God. And as a result, the rebuilding came to a halt. Think about it. God was giving them the chance to rebuild not just a physical structure, but their relationship with Him. The temple wasn't just a building, it was symbolic of God's presence among them. But instead of prioritizing God's presence, they focused on their own needs. They began to build beautiful homes for themselves, making sure they were comfortable, while God's house, His dwelling place, was left in ruins. This is where the internal conflict came in. The Israelites were caught in a battle between what they wanted for themselves and what God wanted for them. They were living in tension between self-interest and spiritual intimacy. This kind of internal struggle is something we all face. It's easy to let our desires for comfort, success, and security take over. We live in a world that tells us to chase after these things, to make sure we're okay before we help others, before we focus on God. We can become so consumed with our own lives that we forget about the things that matter most: our relationship with God, our spiritual growth, and our calling to serve others. Just like the Israelites, we can find ourselves focusing on building our own homes, whether that means our careers, our relationships, or our material possessions, while neglecting the spiritual work that God has called us to. In the case of the Israelites, this internal conflict didn't just cause a temporary delay, it led to a full stop in the rebuilding process for 15 years. And you might think, how could they have let this happen? How could they have gotten so distracted? But the reality is, it happens to all of us. We get busy with life, we get comfortable, and we forget about the work God has called us to. We forget about the importance of nurturing our relationship with Him, of building up His kingdom, of prioritizing spiritual intimacy over personal comfort. And here's the thing, God wasn't angry with them for wanting to build their homes or take care of their personal needs. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that they had allowed their personal needs to overshadow their spiritual needs. God had given them a clear command to rebuild the temple, but they had put that on the back burner. They had neglected their spiritual responsibility in favor of their own comforts. And that's where the problem lies. In Haggai 1:5-6, God speaks again through the prophet, saying, "Consider your ways. You have sown much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you are still thirsty. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. You earn wages, but put them in a purse with holes." God is pointing out something that we all know deep down: when we prioritize our personal needs over spiritual intimacy, it never truly satisfies. We can chase after all the material things we want: better homes, nicer cars, more money, but they won't fulfill the deepest longings of our hearts. We can work ourselves to the bone, thinking that if we just get more, we'll be happy, but we'll never feel truly content. We'll always be left wanting more, feeling empty. And no matter how hard we try, we won't find lasting satisfaction. God's message to the Israelites was clear: until you prioritize my house, until you put me first, nothing else will satisfy. Your material needs will never be enough because they are not the ultimate answer to your deepest needs. Only God can fill that void. And this is the same message for us today. We can try to build our own houses, but if we neglect our relationship with God, if we put our personal ambitions and comforts above our spiritual growth, we will always feel unfulfilled. We'll work hard, but the results will feel hollow. We'll eat, but we'll never be satisfied. We'll drink, but we'll still thirst. This internal conflict is something that many of us wrestle with on a daily basis. We live in a culture that tells us to focus on ourselves, to take care of our own needs first. And there's nothing wrong with taking care of ourselves, but when that becomes our sole focus, we lose sight of the bigger picture. We forget that our true purpose is to serve God, to glorify Him, and to build His kingdom. just like the Israelites. We can get so caught up in building our own homes that we neglect the things that truly matter. We forget that our spiritual health is the foundation for everything else. And when that happens, our growth stalls. We become stagnant. Our passion for God wanes, and we fall into a rut. The good news is that God is always calling us back, just like He did with the Israelites. He's reminding us today to prioritize Him. He's calling us to consider our ways, to examine our hearts, and to refocus on what truly matters. He's asking us to get back to the work He's called us to put Him first, and to build our lives on the foundation of His presence and His Word. And when we do that, everything else will fall into place. Our material needs will still be important, but they won't be our main focus. We'll find true satisfaction in our relationship with God, and He will take care of the rest. In Haggai 1:7-8, God says, "Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build the house, that I may take pleasure in it and be glorified." God is inviting us to return to Him, to get back to the work of rebuilding, to put Him first in everything. It's not too late. No matter how much time we've spent focusing on our own homes, God is always ready to help us get back on track. He's waiting for us to turn our attention back to Him, to prioritize our relationship with Him, and to rebuild the spiritual intimacy that we may have neglected. So the challenge for all of us is this: are we going to let our personal needs and desires take precedence over our spiritual needs? Are we going to keep building our own homes while neglecting God's house? Or are we willing to prioritize our relationship with God, to get back to the work of building His kingdom, and to find true fulfillment in Him? The choice is ours. Let's choose to put God first and rebuild our spiritual lives, knowing that when we do, everything else will fall into place. Alright, so let's fast forward to the moment when God speaks to the people through the prophet Haggai and calls them to reconsider their ways. After all the distractions, the internal conflict, and the external opposition, God doesn't just leave them there in their mess. He calls them to make a change, to recognize where they've gone wrong, and to get back to the work He had originally called them to do. And let me tell you, this moment in the story is powerful because it's a turning point. God's message through Haggai wasn't just a rebuke, it was an invitation to realign their priorities and get back to their spiritual purpose. In Haggai 1:5, God tells them, "Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways." It's like a wake-up call. God isn't angry here, but He's saying, "Look, I want you to think about what's happening. Consider the consequences of putting your own needs first, of neglecting my house, of focusing on building your own homes while leaving my temple in ruins." And God doesn't just say, "Think about it." He wants them to take action. The very next verse, Haggai 1:7 says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways." Again, it's that call to reflect on their lives, to step back and assess where they've gone off track. Now, this is where it gets interesting because the people didn't just hear this message and shrug it off, they actually responded positively. They didn't sit around making excuses or blaming others for their lack of progress. No, they listened to what God was saying, and they took it to heart. In verse 12, we see the people's response. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him. Let that sink in for a second. The people didn't just acknowledge what Haggai said they obeyed. They didn't let the moment slip by. They didn't ignore the call to action. They responded with obedience. And that's what made all the difference. What's powerful about this moment is that it shows us something important about the nature of God. Yes, He confronts us with our mistakes, our distractions, our failures, but He does so with an invitation to return to Him. God doesn't leave us in our guilt and shame. He calls us back into relationship with Him, back into the work He's called us to. And He's so patient with us. He could have easily said, "I'm done with you guys. You've had your chance. But instead, he gives them the opportunity to turn things around. And the people, instead of rejecting God's call, choose to obey. But here's where it gets personal for us. This isn't just a story about the Israelites from thousands of years ago. This is a story about us. Because we too can get off track in our spiritual journeys. We too can find ourselves distracted by the busyness of life, by our personal desires, or by external opposition that makes us want to give up. And just like the Israelites, we can let our spiritual lives take a back seat to everything else. But the good news is, God is still calling us to reconsider our ways. He's still inviting us to realign our priorities and get back to the work of growing spiritually. The people of Israel didn't waste any time. When they heard God's call through Haggai, they acted immediately. There was no hesitation, no procrastination. They got back to the work of rebuilding the temple. And what's amazing is that in verse 13, Haggai tells the people that God was with them in their obedience. It says, "Then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord." Isn't that incredible? God didn't say, "I'll be with you once you've made significant progress." He didn't say, "I'll be with you once the temple is halfway done." No, he said, "I am with you." And that's so comforting because it reminds us that when we choose to get back on track with God, He is right there with us. We're not doing it alone. He's with us, empowering us to move forward and finish what He's called us to do. When I think about this, I'm reminded of how often we get stuck in our own spiritual ruts. Maybe we've been distracted by life's demands. Maybe we've been hit by discouragement, or we've allowed our personal goals and ambitions to take over. But no matter how long we've been off track, God's call is still the same. Consider your ways, reflect on where you are, and come back to me. It's never too late to get back on track with our spiritual journey. And when we do, God promises His presence and His help as we move forward. But here's the real question. How do we respond when God calls us to reconsider our ways? Do we take the time to pause, reflect, and listen? Or do we ignore the call, push it aside, and continue going down the same path? For many of us, it can be easy to get stuck in patterns of neglect, thinking that our spiritual lives can wait or that it's not that big of a deal. But the truth is, our spiritual health impacts everything in our lives. When we're not right with God, it affects our relationships, our work, our peace of mind, and even our physical well-being. Getting back on track spiritually isn't just a nice idea. It's necessary for living a full, abundant life. The Israelites' response is a great model for us. When they heard the call, they didn't just acknowledge it intellectually, they obeyed. They moved forward in faith, trusting that God would help them finish the task He had set before them. And that's the kind of response God is looking for from us today. It's not enough to simply acknowledge that we've gotten off track. We need to obey. We need to take action. That might look like picking up our Bible again, joining a small group, starting to pray more regularly, or getting involved in serving others. Whatever it is, obedience is the key. And here's the thing, when we choose to obey, we don't do it in our own strength. Just as God promised to be with the Israelites, He promises to be with us. He will give us the strength, the wisdom, and the courage we need to take the next step. It's not about our ability to do it perfectly. It's about our willingness to obey and trust that God is with us every step of the way. The people of Israel, after their 15-year pause, were able to pick up the pieces and finish the work. And it's incredible to see that once they obeyed God, things began to fall into place. The temple wasn't rebuilt overnight, but God's presence was with them, and that made all the difference. When we choose to obey God and take action, we can trust that He will give us everything we need to continue on the journey. So let me ask you, how are you responding to God's call today? Are there areas in your life where you've been putting off spiritual growth or ignoring God's voice? It's not too late to turn things around. Like the Israelites, we have the opportunity to reconsider our ways and choose obedience. When we do, we can be confident that God is with us and will help us finish the work He has called us to. So, let's get back to work. Let's get back to building our spiritual lives, knowing that God's presence and power will be with us every step of the way. As we wrap up today's message, I want to encourage you to take a moment and reflect on your own spiritual journey. Have you allowed any areas of your life to drift or be neglected? Maybe it's your time with God, your focus on spiritual growth, or your commitment to serving others. It happens to all of us, but the good news is, it's never too late to realign our hearts and priorities. So, take some time this week to think about where you may need to rebuild and put God first again. I really hope this message has resonated with you and helped you reflect on your own walk with God. If you found it encouraging, feel free to like the video and subscribe so you can continue growing with us. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm really excited for what's ahead as we keep moving forward together.